Hello and welcome. My name is Aaron Stein, Director of the Middle East Program at the Foreign Policy Research Institute in Philadelphia, and you are listening to the Middle East Brief, a podcast focused on developments in the Middle East and why they matter for U.S. foreign policy. Be sure to subscribe to the Middle East Brief on iTunes and Spotify, and sign up to receive FPRI's Weekly Insights newsletter, where a link to the show will be delivered every 2 weeks straight to your inbox at www.fpri.org. Hello and welcome. Today I'm talking to Afshon Ostovar, an assistant professor of national security affairs at the Naval Postgraduate School in Monterey, and a fellow here at FPRI. Afshon, it's good to have you back on the show.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Yeah, I always seem to bug you to come on when Iran's involved, and more pointedly when Iran's allegedly up to some nefarious activity through its clients in the Persian Gulf or in the Gulf region of the Middle East. And about 2 weeks ago is when we had the alleged Iranian-sponsored attacks on Saudi oil facilities. It's been about 2 weeks, so perhaps you could just dive into the attacks themselves and what they may mean for current Iranian policy in the region.
Right. I mean, not to get too detailed into it because the details I think are still pretty fuzzy, but essentially you had a pretty large scale attack against Saudi oil facilities that the Houthis claimed responsibility for immediately. And the attack seemed to combine two things: drones and cruise missiles that were fired either from Iranian territory, if you believe sort of the unnamed U.S. Officials that have been cited in a few news sources, or were fired from Yemen, which the Houthis claim to have done. Iran, of course, says they weren't responsible either way, although they congratulated the Houthis on their attack and told the Saudis, listen, this is what you get when you mess with a lion's tail, which makes it very personal for Iran, right? I mean, the lion is not sort of the emblem of the Houthi nation, so far as I understand it. So Iran is, kind of playing it both ways, both, saying we had nothing to do with this. On the other hand, saying, this is what you get for messing with us. So they're kind of having their cake and eating it too at the moment. Meanwhile, Saudi Arabia is dealing with the most significant attack it's really ever faced, and probably the second most ever sort of psychologically impactful attack. And I say impactful knowing that that's not a word, but I lack the language to sort of describe it. Since the 1979 takeover of the Kaaba in Mecca, right? And the reason I bring that up is because that was a turning point for Saudi Arabia, the 1979 Kaaba takeover. It forced or it encouraged the Saudi royal family to take religion more seriously, to become more conservative, to sort of outpace the Salafis by going right to the right of their right flank in a certain sense. And that's only now being undone by MBS and his sort of nationalist quasi-secular initiatives. This Abqaiq attack, I think, has the possibility of being far more significant geopolitically for Saudi Arabia. I mean, Saudi Arabia was hit in a way that exposed it completely in the region. It exposed its ties with the United States as being, the United States is a protector of Saudi Arabia, but maybe not a responder to all attacks against Saudi Arabia. So what's Saudi Arabia going to do? I mean, they may not respond in the short run, but I think this really has the capacity to change the way that they view Iran and their place in the region in the long run. And the ramifications of this we may not feel for another decade or two or three. But I think they will come back to haunt the region. That's my optimistic assessment.
Yeah, I think that's right. And it seems to fit into, and I know that it hasn't been definitively stated, but I think it's pretty clear that Iranian fingerprints are all over this attack. And so while we do not know with certainty where the attack originated from, I think there's pretty much consensus that it came from the north, i.e., in the north geographically, i.e., from the place where Iran is on the map, situated vis-a-vis Saudi Arabia, and not from the south, which is what I wanted to talk a little bit about. Is that we've had a cycle of escalation here, whereas the war in Yemen has extended. The Iranians have at least, I mean, have overtly supplied the Houthis, their clients, with ballistic missiles that they have fired at Riyadh, and in this case seems to have fired missiles from the north, probably from Iranian territory itself. This is quite the escalation, if you ask me, and it fits into a sort of a policy of Iranian actions to hold global energy supplies at risk. I mean, do you think that this is the Iranian policy to inflict a cost on the U.S. for imposing secondary sanctions on its energy exports? And second, has it been effective? I mean, do you think that the Iranians have managed to escape here, or is without American retaliation, or is the book still being written?
Yeah, to answer your first question, yes, I do think this is Iran responding to pressure, and precisely by attacking sort of the what it can, sort of the global energy supplies, and particularly those coming out of the Middle East. Whether and obviously the evidence seems to be pointing that they were fired from the north. Iran is likely sort of responsible. Whether it was fired from Iranian territory or somehow on the border with Iraq. And even had the Houthis been behind it, the technology that the Houthis would have used would have likely been Iranian supplied anyway. And I think that the fingerprints, coming out of the forensic evidence will probably, show as much. Whether Iran's been successful or not, I think is a more complicated question. And I think the book is still being written on that one. I'm sort of writing it at the moment, so I'd like it to end at some point so I can stop writing. But I don't think that we're at that point where we can say whether Iran's being successful or not. What they are being successful at, let's say that all of these attacks, the attacks on shipping and this attack combined over the last few months, have been orchestrated by Iran directly. They've certainly been successful at getting away with this stuff, right? At staying below whatever the threshold for escalation is. They've certainly challenged all the rhetoric from the U.S. administration to come down hard on Iran as being hollow. They've challenged their neighbors to show that they have no response to Iranian aggression. So they have achieved, I think, something in the way of carving out a space for their military might that they've been sort of, developing over the decades, particularly since the end of the Iran-Iraq war. From the 90s to the 2000s till now, Iran's been working to this point, right? And Iran's neighbors have all been worrying about it. The ballistic missiles, the drones, the regional influence. They all saw it as sort of Iran becoming more powerful, but Iran also being able to dictate terms to them in the region. This is what they feared. This is why they lean on the United States and foreign powers to sort of be a check or a curb on Iranian ambitions. And I think they're seeing sort of in real time the fruition of those Iranian capabilities. Why I hesitate to say that Iran has been effective, however, is that Iran is still stuck in the same situation. It still has crippling sanctions placed upon it. It still refuses to negotiate with the United States to address those sanctions. It wants to sort of address sanctions sort of through, a form of compellence to compel the United States to walk away from sanctions, but that doesn't seem to be working. It wants to drive U.S. forces out of the Persian Gulf, but everything it does just hardens their position in the Persian Gulf, if not brings more in. So, in many ways, Iranian sort of behavior runs counter to Iran's sort of overall aims and goals, and I think that's the challenge for the Islamic Republic. Is okay, you are getting something out of this. It must feel great. To be a put upon nation, to feel like you can finally, punch your neighbors and larger powers in the nose and get away with it. But even though you're getting away with it, you're not actually changing your lot. You're not actually changing your situation. And I think this is going to be the struggle what continues to write this chapter in Middle East history for Iran is that if nothing changes, if sanctions don't go away, if they're not loosened, if the U.S. doesn't give in, then what's Iran's takeaway from that attack? One, it takes away that, okay, we can get away with it. Two, it takes away that it was not enough, right? It was not enough to change the attitudes or the policies of the United States. So what do? Do you do a larger attack? Do you do a different attack? Do you attack the U.S. more directly? Or do you change tactics altogether and say we've proved our point kinetically or in terms of military power, now we're going to, now we have handled the situation, now we've shown ourselves to be strong, now we can sort of enter the negotiating table sort of on more equal terms. I honestly don't know which way they'll go. I think that the trajectory suggests that there will be more attacks before there'll be negotiations, if negotiations are ever there. I think the 2020 elections are in the back of the minds of the Iranians too, and so they may not be planning on talking with any U.S. administration until after those elections. I think it's still being written.
I mean, would you say that this attack differs slightly? I mean, I would say this attack differs pretty radically from the others, and in this case, I'm talking about the indirect attacks through clients with the rocketing of Riyadh, and then the placing of mines to disable, but not destroy, but disable some ships as they were passing or were about to pass through the Strait of Hormuz. In that all those were indirect, where this one, it by all accounts seems to have originated from inside Iran. The origin from which the missiles were fired or the drones were flown were from in country. And then I believe that the forensic evidence is going to show that many of these components, while commercial and off the shelf, there will be specific components that absolutely link back to Iran and that are sort of unique identifiers.
Right.
So is this one different from the others, both in terms of scale and what it is that they attacked, but also in terms of the method? They tried to get the Houthis to claim it, but that's falling apart rather quickly. And so did they step too far with this? And so could this lead towards a de-escalation, or is this just simply saying that we're here and you have to take us seriously?
Well, I think it's a dramatic escalation. It's a very different attack. I think both certainly in scale. I think in substance it's a very different attack, right? They're not attacking a boat or disabling a boat or a tanker, in the middle of the ocean that does no harm. They're attacking the lifeblood of a neighboring country. And if they did so from Iranian soil, then yes, it's a direct attack, and it would be an act of war, I think, by any definition that anybody would use. It's certainly a huge escalation. I still think that the tanker attacks, I still consider those direct attacks so far as we understand them to be. That Iranian sort of vessels placed those limpet mines on tankers and did so sort of with intent. I saw those as direct Iranian attacks, except they were very limited in scale and in scope, right? They were punctuation marks. They weren't statements. This is huge, and I think in any given moment, I would have seen this as sort of a red line that would have led to escalation, But I think what we're seeing now is Iran sort of proving in a way that nobody really wants to escalate with Iran right now, at least not over this. The United States, the U.S. president doesn't seem to want to escalate over sort of attacks on third parties. The Saudis don't seem to feel that they're in a place to escalate with Iran at the moment. I wouldn't take sort of Saudi their slow or gradual response to the Iranians as being indicative of a desire to make peace with Iran, though. I think it's just them realizing that at the moment they don't have the tools or the capacity or the know-how or whatever to go after Iran today. But but that may not be, that may not be the same in the future. So yeah, I do think it's a huge change, and I think in some ways that's what's so puzzling about this moment, just from sort of a foreign affairs perspective. This is such a large, important, game-changing attack, or at least it should be. But in many ways, it's sort of like a tree falling in the forest, right? Maybe a few people heard it, maybe nobody heard it. It's gone by with a whimper so far. But I think it's much larger than that. And so that's why I don't think that the immediate response is going to be sort of the sum total of what is sort of awakened by this attack in terms of Saudi decision making or regional decision making vis-a-vis Iran.
Yeah, what's funny is when you mentioned the limpet attacks, it's indicative to how far things have moved. In that I forgot that those attacks had originated from Iranian soil. Sorry about that. And two, in that I left out that they shot down an American drone flying,
Yeah.
a very expensive American drone flying over international airspace. So yes, so it's indicative of how hot the summer has been as we move into fall. That I could leave out two attacks as focusing on two others, i.e. those focused on the Strait of Hormuz and then Saudi oil exports. But there is, and I would say one thing, and I want to get your opinion on it, is that I think one of the things holding people back is the acute vulnerability that the Saudis must feel, but also the Emiratis and other people in the region, because Iran has managed to take advantage of regional chaos, very effectively. And I don't say that in sort of a nice way, but just a fact of reality. And that if they are willing to attack Saudi Arabia from sort of both sides, the north and the south, that's going to tax your resources in ways that are very difficult to defend against and will impose a escalatory cost on Saudi that make de-escalation a potential option, even though the attack was without precedent. And it's within that context that I wanted to talk about what's going on today, or at least the start of today. We're recording this on Monday. It's about 1:10 on the East Coast time that the United Nations General Assembly meeting it has just kicked off. And the French in particular have sought to play a more active role in de-escalating, both in trying to restart talks between the U.S. and the Iranians on the nuclear file, but now that's been sort of brought into regional issues. What do you think about the Iranian sort of escalatory options here? Do they have escalation dominance? And two, is there a hope that we can de-escalate through talks, or are both sides, the U.S. and the Iranians, just still not interested?
I don't know. I mean, this is, at the end of the day, this is about individuals deciding whether to talk or not, and I think the US president would like to talk. I think it's really on the Iranian side of whether they want to talk or not. The Iranians say, why would we talk with you? We can't trust you anyway. And okay, fine, whatever. But you're not talking. So what are you getting out of it? What are you really accomplishing here? Do they have escalation dominance? So long as nobody, responds, sure. But not in the grand scheme of things. They have a limited stockpile of rockets and drones. They can, they can launch, salvos upon salvos, but at some point they're going to be done. And their ability to replenish is going to be compromised by, the immense sanctions on them, and just, trouble sort of working in the international space. That is to say that were there to be a war, they may start off on a strong footing, but I don't think they would last as long as they think they would. Right? They're still gonna run into problems of capacity, industrial capacity, military capacity, etc. But that being said, they have proved their point. Right? They are much stronger than they were. They are much stronger than their neighbors. They have a do or die sort of attitude. They have a much larger country. They have a much more sort of diversified and spread out sort of military industry. Their facilities are more hardened. They feel like they can withstand a conflict much better than a small country like the Emirates, right? were Iran to train or aim its missiles, at Abu Dhabi or Dubai, those cities would suffer much more than Iran would by an Emirati response, right? And so long as the U.S. is reluctant to sort of get involved, then what do the Emiratis or the Saudis hang their hat on? Not much. So yeah, I think they have proved their point that they can essentially bully their neighbors into de-escalating. The problem is that the root causes are still there, right? And the root causes aren't going away. And for Iran, those root causes are sanctions. For the rest of the region, the root causes are Iran's regional influence, right? The Houthis are still a problem for Saudi Arabia. Even if they want to make peace with Iran, they're still going to have trouble with the Houthis. They would have better luck, making peace with the Houthis than with Iran. And Yemen is still going to be a mess. That the chaos is still going to be there for groups like Al Qaeda, whatever, to sort of proliferate. Iraq is still going to be dominated by Iranian influence. Syria is also sort of a question mark. You have the Israeli component, which we haven't even talked about, right? But while Iran is sort of making gains in some respect in the Gulf, it's also losing momentum in Syria, and in some sense in Iraq, to Israel. I mean, as much as Iran has been able to sort of get away with sort of strikes or sabotage sort of in the Gulf over the last few months, Israel has shown that it can bomb Iran and Iran's clients sort of, with impunity in Syria and Iraq. And Iran has no answer to that, right? So you've got this sort of triangle competition between Iran, its neighbors, and Israel that overlap in spaces but are also disconnected in others. And that's a hard problem for Iran to solve. It's a hard problem for the U.S. to solve. It's a hard problem for Iran's region, Iran's neighbors to solve. So at the end of the day, none of this is going to go away. Even if you eliminate sanctions, it's not going to go away. Even if, Saudi Arabia and the Emiratis decide, okay, we're on Team Iran. You made your point, let's all be friends. It's not going to go away. Iran is still at war with other regional states, and that's going to continue to play out. And so I think for Iran, they feel like they can sort of survive this stuff. They can adapt to this stuff. They can navigate sort of the region better than anybody else because they have the will, they have the methods, they have the allies, they have sort of the ability to work below the state level, which insulates them from a lot of sort of the systemic and structural issues that stymie Saudi Arabia or the Emirates, Israel, or even the United States from acting. But I don't know if they see a terminus to their behavior. I don't know if they see sort of an endpoint. And I think that's what's sort of troubling and challenging is that this is sort of, I feel that we're in the middle of something. But I don't see, even if there's a second JCPOA, I don't see an end to it.
Yeah. And so if you had to, just as we wrap up here, there's been all sorts of policy prescriptions thrown about, ranging from retaliatory American cruise missile strikes. I think the New York Times reported in quite some detail today about deliberations about a cyber attack, all the way towards, perhaps on the other end, I'll include myself in this, regional negotiations, including some sort of form of sanctions relief. I call it the bribing option. You're essentially paying them not to fire missiles at Saudi Arabia. But none of that is perfect, I think is what you're saying. I tend to agree with you. But if you had to make some policy suggestions about what to pursue moving forward, thinking beyond just whether we respond with military force or not, or open negotiations or not, does this ultimately have to be resolved either by the Iranian government collapsing or accepting the Iranian government?
Well, I don't think it's either of those, right? Like the Islamic Republic's not going to collapse, at least I don't think it will. It's a pretty strong regime. It's a pretty strong state. Of course, the Shah had a strong state too. I know I've written about this stuff. Anything can happen, but I don't see it going anywhere. And I don't see anybody sort of having the ability to do anything about it. I think two things need to change in order for the Islamic Republic to sort of escape this moment and for everybody else to find peace. I think the Islamic Republic needs to understand that, in order to get the United States to care less about the Middle East, the Islamic Republic needs to lay off Israel, right? If the Islamic Republic really wanted to solve its problems, it would just say, you know what, Israel, we're going to adopt the Saudi position. We don't like you. We don't think you're legitimate, but we're no longer going to supply clients with weapons to target you, right? We're no longer going to have this pie in the sky sort of hope of retaking Jerusalem. We're just going to sort of, do our thing over here and let sort of history and fate sort of take care of you. If they did that, I think within successive U.S. administrations, there would be almost no interest in the Middle East if Iran was not effectively at war with Israel. Oil is important. We care about oil security. But if Iran is not at war with Israel, Iran has fewer problems with the United States, and Iran has fewer problems with its neighbors, and all of a sudden, the Houthis matter less, the Shia militias in Iraq matter less, Assad matters less. And Iran, the Islamic Republic, can frankly have its cake and eat it too. Of course, that's not how the Islamic Republic operates. That's not something that it's going to do. So short of that, I think the policy options are all limited to sort of the short-term horizon, right? Like, how do we get out of this moment? How do we escape this moment? Without escalation. I think the one thing that everybody agrees on is wars not that useful at making good things happen. Yeah, and so I think de-escalating is important, right? I think you can give Iran some things. I think you can do some sanctions relief. I thought the JCPOA was a fine agreement with real problems, but a fine sort of non-proliferation agreement. There's no reason we should have walked away from it. On the other hand, you've got this sort of like conundrum, I think, in DC of, you don't want to reward bad behavior, right? So if Iran feels like all they need to do is strike Saudi Arabia in order to get what they want, then we're in a bad position, right? So, I think if you give them some sanctions relief, you at least open the door to negotiations. You give them something. You let them sort of be the big man on campus for a week, and maybe you get something out of it. The problem, I think, with sanctions relief from a strategic perspective, from a very cold-hearted strategic perspective, is that if it's piecemeal and not total, right, then Iran just may feel like, okay, it's etched away at the sanctions regime, but it hasn't made it collapse. So it just needs to keep pushing forward, right, until you have a full and complete sort of capitulation on the behalf of the United States. And that's probably going to be something that's hard to achieve, at least with this administration, which is why I think you're probably not going to have any significant traction until we're closer to the 2020 election. I just assume that Iran believes that should the Trump administration lose and a Democratic administration take over, that Democratic administration, by virtue of not wanting to sort of continue anything associated with the Trump administration, is going to take a softer line with Iran, whether that's just a full rejoining of JCPOA or whatever. Which I think makes it harder for the Trump administration to make any sort of peace with Iran at the moment. I think they're going to have to give more than maybe just a little sanctions relief. On the other hand, I think finding ways to de-escalate it, finding ways to get people in the room, finding ways to sort of give diplomacy a chance getting the Saudis and the Emiratis and the Iranians to talk, giving them some sanctions relief, I think is all for the better. You don't really gain anything from being sort of, I think, bullheaded about it. I don't think escalation is the answer, because where does it end? What's the purpose of it? Is it just to punish Iran? Is it just to sort of reestablish some sort of deterrent? How far are we willing to escalate in order to establish a deterrent? These are all questions that I think need to be answered by the U.S. administration, and maybe they have, but I don't think they have been sufficiently. And so I think if we want to avoid war, then yeah, I think sort of the de-escalatory path is the right one to take. I'm not convinced. I think it's worth the risk to take it, but I'm not convinced that Iran is going to take its foot off the gas if it's only given piecemeal relief, at least not anytime soon.
Well, with that, Afshon, it's always great to have you on the show. I appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Always.
My pleasure. And thanks everybody for listening, and stay tuned for more, because I'm sure that this isn't the last we're going to hear about this. So thanks everybody again.